By the late 5th millennium BCE, a network of pastoral communities occupied the open grasslands north of the Black Sea. Stretching from the lower Danube basin in the west to the Volga River in the east, this region, known as the Pontic-Caspian steppe, formed a continuous ecological corridor characterized by flat terrain, seasonal rainfall, and expansive grazing land. Archaeological investigation indicates that this environment supported mobile herding societies whose economic practices differed fundamentally from the sedentary agricultural cultures to the south. The steppe's geography imposed specific constraints and opportunities. Long winters, limited forest cover, and variable precipitation favored pastoral subsistence over intensive farming. Rivers such as the Dniester, Dnieper, Don, and Volga functioned as natural movement corridors, facilitating seasonal migration and regional interaction. Archaeologists have identified settlement patterns that reflect this mobility, with temporary habitation sites, shallow occupational layers, and limited permanent architecture dating between approximately 4,500 and 3,000 BCE. Among the earliest archaeological cultures associated with this region is the Khvalynsk culture, dated to roughly 4,700 to 3,800 BCE and centered along the Middle Volga. Excavations at Khvalynsk burial sites have uncovered evidence of early social differentiation, including copper ornaments, stone tools, and animal offerings placed within individual graves. These burials suggest the presence of emerging social hierarchies within mobile communities, supported by control over livestock and exchange networks rather than land ownership. Further west, the Sredny Stog culture, dated to approximately 4,500 to 3,500 BCE, occupied territories along the Dnieper River and adjacent steppe zones. Archaeological remains include semi-subterranean dwellings, domesticated cattle and horses, and early evidence of riding or traction use. Bitware analysis on horse teeth from sites such as Derivka has been interpreted as possible early evidence of horse management, though scholarly debate remains regarding the extent and function of this practice during the period. The material culture associated with these steppe societies reflects a subsistence economy centered on livestock herding, particularly cattle, sheep, and horses. Zooarchaeological studies indicate selective breeding and seasonal herd movement, suggesting a well-developed pastoral strategy. These practices allowed communities to exploit large territories while maintaining flexibility in response to environmental variation. Unlike sedentary agricultural populations, steppe groups were not bound to fixed settlements, enabling sustained regional interaction. Linguistic reconstruction provides an additional line of evidence linking these communities to the early Indo-European language family. Comparative analysis of later Indo-European languages has allowed scholars to reconstruct elements of Proto-Indo-European, including vocabulary related to cattle, guz, sheep, H2OS, kinship relations, and wheeled vehicles. The presence of shared terminology for wagons and wheels places the proto-language after the invention of wheeled transport, dated archaeologically to around 3,500 BCE, aligning with the late phases of steppe cultural development. The reconstructed lexicon also indicates a social structure organized around extended kin groups and patriarchal lineage systems. Terms for familial roles, inheritance, and social obligations suggest that identity was maintained through descent and reciprocal relationships, rather than territorial administration. This linguistic evidence corresponds closely with the archaeological record, which shows limited permanent infrastructure but consistent ritual and burial practices across wide areas. Importantly, the Eurasian steppe hypothesis does not describe the Indo-Europeans as a single, unified population. Instead, it identifies a continuum of related speech communities connected through shared subsistence strategies, mobility, patterns, and cultural practices. Archaeological variation between sites reflects regional adaptation rather than cultural isolation. Material similarities indicate sustained contact and interaction rather than centralized control or mass migration events. Genetic research conducted in the early 21st century has further reinforced the steppe model. Ancient DNA samples from later Yamnao-associated populations show ancestry components traceable to earlier steppe groups, with genetic markers spreading into Central and Northern Europe after 3000 BCE. While genetics does not directly identify language, the correlation between population movement and linguistic expansion has strengthened the case for a steppe origin of Indo-European languages. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, the Pontic-Caspian steppe had developed into a dynamic zone of interaction linking Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Pastoral economies had stabilized, mobility had become routine, and cultural systems capable of transmission across generations were firmly established. As technological and social innovations continued to emerge within this environment, these steppe communities formed the foundation for subsequent Indo-European dispersals across Eurasia. Before we continue exploring the origins of the Indo-Europeans, take a moment to subscribe and click the bell icon to get your daily Nightfall history video. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this journey into the Eurasian steppe do you find most fascinating? No Proto-Indo-European text survives, yet its grammar and vocabulary can still be reconstructed. Linguists rely on a comparative method, analyzing systematic correspondences between words, phonemes, and grammatical structures across the Indo-European language family. By identifying shared roots and consistent sound changes, scholars can infer features of the ancestor language spoken thousands of years ago on the Eurasian steppe. This method, first systematically applied in the 19th century, laid the foundation for modern historical linguistics, allowing researchers to trace commonalities across languages such as Sanskrit, Ancient Greek, Latin, Hittite, and Old Irish. Reconstruction begins with phonology, the study of sound systems. Linguists observe patterns of consonant and vowel shifts, known as Grimm's and Werner's laws, to establish regular correspondences between languages. Morphology, the structure of words and their inflections, further supports reconstruction. Common endings for nouns, verbs, and pronouns reveal consistent paradigms, indicating a shared system of declensions and conjugations. These correspondences provide evidence for grammatical gender, number, and tense in the proto-language, offering insights into how speakers structured thought and communication. Core vocabulary provides chronological and cultural context. Terms for wagons, keklos, horses, achequos, and metallurgy indicate that Proto-Indo-European developed after the invention of wheeled transport, approximately 3,500 BCE. Other reconstructed words, including those for family relations, pastoral animals, and natural features such as rivers and forests, correspond with the material environment of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. These lexical patterns align with archaeological evidence from Sredny Stog and Khvalynsk cultures, demonstrating that linguistic and material histories can reinforce each other without implying a single, uniform population. Phylogenetic and computational methods have refined early reconstructions. By modeling linguistic change over time, modern researchers can propose branching sequences and estimate divergence dates for Indo-European subgroups. For example, Anatolian languages, including Hittite and Luwian, display archaisms suggesting an early split from the main Proto-Indo-European lineage. Conversely, Balto-Slavic, Celtic, and Indo-Iranian branches reflect later diversification. These findings provide a framework for understanding the temporal and spatial spread of Indo-European languages. Without presuming political or ethnic unity, linguistic reconstruction also highlights the limits of inference. While shared vocabulary suggests certain cultural practices, such as wheeled transport or animal husbandry, language alone cannot define identity or political organization. Proto-Indo-European speakers were likely a mosaic of semi-independent communities rather than a cohesive polity. Similarly, reconstructed terms for deities or rituals offer clues about belief systems, but cannot fully capture regional variation or local adaptation. The method of reconstruction relies on both internal evidence, such as recurring morphological patterns, and external evidence, including borrowings in neighboring language families and alignment with archaeological timelines. For instance, cognates for metallurgy correspond with known early bronze artifacts in steppe sites, providing temporal anchors that help situate linguistic evolution. Reconstructed kinship terms match social structures inferred from burial patterns, suggesting that certain forms of social organization were widespread among early Indo-European groups. By integrating comparative linguistics with archaeology and environmental data, researchers can create a multi-layered picture of Proto-Indo-European society. Language reconstruction provides a map of conceptual and material culture, revealing how pastoral mobility, seasonal settlement, and technological innovation shaped communication and knowledge transmission. These linguistic patterns correspond closely with emerging archaeological cultures, establishing continuity between reconstructed vocabulary, social practices, and the ecological context of the steppe. By the end of this period, Proto-Indo-European had crystallized into a system capable of supporting extensive communication across mobile communities. Vocabulary, grammar, and conceptual structures allowed for the transmission of economic, social, and ritual knowledge, forming a foundation for the later diversification of Indo-European languages across Europe, Anatolia, and South Asia. The intersection of language and archaeology thus provides a critical window into the structure and organization of steppe societies before their widespread dispersal. The domestication of the horse fundamentally altered Eurasian mobility. Archaeological evidence indicates that steppe communities began managing horses systematically between approximately 3,500 and 3000 BCE, establishing a technological and economic foundation that would shape the expansion of early Indo-European societies. Sites in the Botai region of northern Kazakhstan, dating to around 3,500 BCE, contain clear material traces of horse domestication, including corrals, post holes for enclosures, and concentrations of horse bones exhibiting specific butchery and wear patterns. Analysis of these remains demonstrates that horses were not only consumed as a food source but were also increasingly utilized for traction and, potentially, mounted mobility. Additional evidence for domestication comes from dental and skeletal analysis. Archaeologists have documented bit wear on horse teeth, suggesting the use of early bridles or other control mechanisms. While the precise methods remain debated, these modifications indicate intentional management of horse movement. Stable isotope studies further support sustained human-horse interactions, demonstrating that horses were selectively fed or grazed under controlled conditions rather than foraging entirely independently. These findings reveal a shift from opportunistic hunting to systematic husbandry, reflecting deliberate technological innovation. The broader impact of horse domestication on pastoral communities was significant. Mounted mobility expanded seasonal herding ranges, allowing communities to exploit larger territories while maintaining relatively small populations. Communication across the steppe became more efficient, facilitating interaction, trade, and information transfer between distant groups. Archaeological evidence of early wagon tracks and roads shows that domesticated horses may also have been integrated into draft systems, enhancing the transport of goods, tools, and resources. This combination of mounted and traction use represents a key factor in the expansion and resilience of steppe societies. Material culture associated with early horse management demonstrates a high degree of integration with social and ritual life. Botai burials and sacrificial pits contain horse remains alongside domestic tools, indicating that the animal played both practical and symbolic roles. In later steppe cultures, including Yamnaya settlements, the prominence of horse-related artifacts, such as harness fittings and figurines, further underscores the animal's centrality to economic, social, and ceremonial practices. These developments suggest that horse domestication was not a singular technological innovation but a transformative adaptation with widespread cultural ramifications. Genetic analysis has corroborated archaeological observations. Studies of ancient horse DNA reveal distinct lineages associated with domesticated populations in the steppe region. Comparisons between Botai specimens and modern domestic horses indicate that early domesticated stock contributed to some contemporary breeds, although later migrations and breeding practices reshaped these lineages. The genetic evidence aligns with isotopic and morphological data, reinforcing the conclusion that human-horse relationships became increasingly structured and intentional during this period. The technological implications of domestication extend to conflict and security. Mounted mobility allowed rapid response to intergroup competition and predation, facilitating both defense and raiding strategies. Archaeological records of fortified settlements and weapons in the late 4th millennium BCE suggest that horse riding contributed to tactical advantages in local skirmishes, enabling the effective projection of force across the steppe. These developments intersect with social hierarchy, as individuals capable of controlling horses gain status and influence within pastoral communities. Furthermore, The domestication of the horse had lasting consequences for the dispersal of Proto-Indo-European speakers. Enhanced mobility permitted broader seasonal and long-distance movement, which, in combination with wheeled transport, supported gradual migration into Europe, Anatolia, and Central Asia. Archaeological correlations between horse management sites and early Indo-European material cultures suggest that the horse played a central role in facilitating these population movements. Its use enabled communities to traverse ecological zones that would have otherwise constrained mobility, creating conditions conducive to cultural transmission and linguistic expansion. By the end of this period, horse domestication had become a defining feature of steppe pastoralism. Stable herding practices, coupled with mounting and draft capabilities, transformed the dynamics of economy, communication, and mobility. Archaeological, isotopic, and genetic evidence collectively indicate that the horse was no longer merely a subsistence resource, but a critical instrument for societal organization. Its management structured the geography of interaction, the patterns of settlement, and the reach of emerging Indo-European communities. As mobility increased, communities could undertake migrations spanning hundreds of kilometers, connecting the Pontic-Caspian steppe to distant ecological zones. These movements laid the groundwork for the expansion of Proto-Indo-European culture and technology across Eurasia. The domestication of the horse thus represents not only a technological milestone but a pivotal factor in the demographic, economic, and cultural transformations that shaped early Indo-European societies. Subsequent archaeological phases reveal an intensification of mounted and wagon-based activity, foreshadowing the widespread dispersals that would define the steppe's historical impact. The wheel allowed entire communities, not just warriors, to migrate. Archaeological and linguistic evidence indicates that wheeled transport emerged on the Eurasian steppe by the late 4th millennium BCE, transforming mobility, subsistence, and cultural transmission among early Indo-European societies. Excavations in regions such as the northern Caucasus and the Pontic-Caspian steppe have revealed wheel tracks, cart remnants, and miniature wagon models dating to approximately 3500 to 3000 BCE. These findings demonstrate that wagons and carts were not experimental technologies but integral components of pastoral life, enabling communities to move livestock, goods, and household structures across vast distances. Linguistic reconstruction reinforces the archaeological record. Proto-Indo-European terms for wheeled vehicles, such as keklos and associated components, including axles and yokes, suggest that the concept of wagons was widespread within the language community before its speakers dispersed into Europe and Central Asia. The alignment of lexical evidence with material findings provides a rare instance in which language and archaeology converge to indicate technological innovation. Terms describing axle dimensions, wheel orientation, and draft animals reflect practical knowledge of vehicle construction, implying that wheeled transport was used in everyday pastoral and logistical contexts. The adoption of wagons significantly expanded the range of seasonal migration. Steppe pastoralists could relocate entire households along predictable routes between summer and winter pastures, maintaining continuity in herding practices while exploiting multiple ecological zones. Archaeological surveys indicate that settlements associated with corded ware and Yamnaya groups were systematically positioned along rivers and lowland corridors suitable for wheeled movement. Such placement optimized the efficiency of transporting supplies and animals, suggesting an intentional strategy for large-scale mobility. Material evidence indicates that wagons facilitated the movement of surplus goods and specialized items, including metal tools, textiles, and ritual objects. Wagon burials and associated grave goods, while limited, demonstrate the social and symbolic significance of wheeled vehicles. In some instances, wagons were interred alongside high-status individuals, indicating that control over transport technology was linked to prestige and the ability to coordinate community movements. The presence of wagon iconography in pottery and figurines further reflects the cultural integration of these vehicles into steppe society. The technological implications of wheeled transport extend to settlement patterns and intergroup interaction. Mobile communities could access distant territories without abandoning subsistence security, enabling population expansion into Central Europe, the Carpathians, and the Balkans. This mobility facilitated not only the movement of people but also the transmission of ideas, rituals, and material culture. Archaeological evidence demonstrates continuity in burial practices, pottery styles, and metallurgical techniques across regions connected by wagon routes, suggesting that wheeled transport underpinned broader cultural horizons rather than serving solely as a means of conquest. In addition, wagons enhanced strategic flexibility. Communities could respond to environmental stress, resource scarcity, or intergroup competition by relocating quickly. Sites with wheel ruts and traces of temporary enclosures indicate the integration of wagons into pastoral logistics. Draft animals, including oxen and horses, allowed for heavier loads, enabling the transport of equipment that supported both subsistence and craft production. These innovations increased resilience, allowing communities to maintain mobility while sustaining social networks and ritual practices. The combination of wagons and domesticated horses amplified the impact of wheeled transport. While horses initially may have drawn smaller carts, the progressive refinement of harnessing techniques increased payload and speed, supporting seasonal migration and extended foraging ranges. Archaeologists have identified where patterns on both wagons and animal bones consistent with sustained use for traction, confirming that these technologies were integrated into the economic and logistical systems of steppe societies. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, wheeled transport had become a defining feature of early Indo-European pastoralism. The ability to move entire households, goods, and livestock over long distances facilitated demographic diffusion and cultural continuity. Unlike narratives of sudden invasion, archaeological evidence points to gradual, systematic expansion across the steppe and into neighboring regions. The wheel functioned as a practical instrument of settlement strategy, economic coordination, and cultural transmission, laying the groundwork for the dispersal of Indo-European languages and traditions. These technological innovations supported the formation of expansive cultural horizons. As wagons connected communities over hundreds of kilometers, material culture, including burial customs, ceramics, and metallurgical techniques, displays a coherence that corresponds to linguistic and genetic patterns observed in later populations. Wheeled transport, therefore, was not merely a tool of movement. It became a central mechanism by which early Indo-European societies structured interaction, maintained social cohesion, and projected influence across the Eurasian steppe. Some Indo-European languages froze in time earlier than others. Among the earliest identifiable branches is the Anatolian group, which includes languages such as Hittite, Luwian, and Palaic. Linguistic and archaeological evidence indicates that these languages diverged from Proto-Indo-European well before the formation of most other Indo-European subgroups. Anatolian speakers migrated southward from the Pontic-Caspian steppe into the regions of modern-day Turkey by the early 2nd millennium BCE, establishing settlements that would later give rise to the Hittite Empire and associated cultures. The divergence of the Anatolian branch is supported by linguistic archaism. Hittite retains certain grammatical forms absent in other Indo-European languages, including unique verb conjugations and the preservation of laryngeal sounds hypothesized in reconstructed Proto-Indo-European phonology. Comparative studies show that these features reflect an early separation from the main proto-language, prior to innovations seen in Western and Eastern Indo-European groups. Such linguistic conservatism allows scholars to trace the timing of divergence and the probable route of southward migration into Anatolia. Archaeological evidence complements linguistic reconstruction. Excavations at Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite kingdom, and surrounding sites reveal settlement layers, fortifications, and material culture indicating steppe-influenced migration patterns. Pottery styles, burial practices, and metalwork display elements that are compatible with earlier steppe traditions, suggesting that Anatolian migrants retained cultural features even as they adapted to new ecological and political contexts. These material traces provide a tangible framework for the linguistic hypotheses regarding early divergence. The migration into Anatolia appears to have been gradual, involving small, mobile communities rather than large-scale population replacements. Archaeological stratigraphy indicates continuity in local settlement alongside the introduction of new technologies, such as bronze metallurgy, wagons, and horse husbandry. These innovations may have facilitated the movement of people across the challenging terrain of Anatolia, allowing for integration into pre-existing societies while establishing distinct Indo-European linguistic enclaves. Textual evidence from Hittite cuneiform tablets, dating to the mid-2nd millennium BCE, illustrates the early institutionalization of the Anatolian languages. Administrative, legal, and ritual records confirm the presence of a literate elite, capable of preserving linguistic features over generations. For instance, treaties and royal correspondence reveal standardized forms of Hittite that reflect archaisms traced to Proto-Indo-European. The preservation of these linguistic features highlights the role of bureaucratic structures in maintaining the distinctiveness of the Anatolian branch. The divergence of Anatolian languages also provides chronological context for the broader Indo-European dispersal. Anatolian represents one of the earliest splits, preceding the differentiation of Indo-Iranian, Balto-Slavic, Celtic, and Italic branches. Its separation aligns with material evidence of steppe expansion into the Balkans and Aegean regions, suggesting that southward migration into Anatolia occurred contemporaneously with other movements across Central Europe and the Caucasus. Linguistic divergence, therefore, corresponds closely with archaeological patterns of migration and settlement. Integration into Anatolia required adaptation to local geography and existing populations. Steppe migrants settled in valleys and plateaus suitable for agriculture, pastoralism, and resource extraction, while maintaining key aspects of their linguistic and cultural identity. Excavations indicate that Anatolian Indo-European speakers engaged with native groups, adopting certain technologies and practices without fully assimilating. This process produced a distinctive linguistic and material culture that retained deep connections to the steppe origin. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Anatolian branch had established itself as a separate linguistic entity. Its speakers formed political and cultural networks centered on Hattusa and other regional hubs, laying the foundation for subsequent imperial structures. Archaeological, textual, and linguistic evidence together demonstrates that Anatolian Indo-Europeans followed a divergent path from their steppe ancestors, creating one of the earliest and most distinct Indo-European branches. Later branches, including Indo-Iranian and European groups, would follow different migration paths, adapting to varied ecological and social environments across Eurasia. The study of the Anatolian divergence provides a chronological anchor for understanding the sequence and timing of these broader dispersals, illustrating how geographic movement and linguistic evolution are intertwined in the early history of the Indo-European family. Ritual, language, and warfare converged on the Eurasian steppe. By the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, populations associated with the Sintashta culture, circa 2100 to 1800 BCE, and its successor, the Andronovo horizon, circa 1800 to 1400 BCE, developed complex social and technological systems that would underpin the emergence of the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European family. Archaeological sites across the forest steppe region of the Ural and Volga rivers reveal fortified settlements, elaborate burial practices, and evidence of advanced metallurgy, particularly in chariot construction. These material innovations were closely tied to both ritual practices and military organization. Chariot technology is a defining feature of Sintashta culture. Excavations at Sintashta and nearby sites, such as Archaim, reveal fortified settlements containing evidence of wheel and axle construction, bronze weaponry, and horse burials. Analysis of bit wear and harness fittings confirms the use of horses for traction and potentially mounted mobility. Chariots enabled small, mobile, and heavily armed groups to exert control over territory, project force across steppe landscapes, and coordinate seasonal migrations. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that these vehicles were used in both practical and ritual contexts, linking warfare to community organization and social hierarchy. Ritual fire cults provide another window into early Indo-Iranian culture. Excavated altars, hearths, and ceremonial pits indicate the centrality of fire in domestic, funerary, and communal rites. Comparative study of Indo-Iranian religious vocabulary, preserved in the Rigveda and the Avesta, shows consistent references to sacred fires, divine guardians of fire, and ritual offerings. Linguistic analysis of these texts allows reconstruction of Proto-Indo-Iranian terms for ritual implements, priestly roles, and cosmological concepts, which correspond closely with archaeological evidence of fire-centered ceremonial spaces in Santashta and Andronovo settlements. Metallurgy played a critical role in both material and social development. Bronze weapons, spearheads, and tools were widely distributed within settlements, indicating specialized production and access regulated by emerging social elites. The correlation between chariot construction, weaponry, and elite burial goods demonstrates the integration of technology into social hierarchy. Archaeologists have documented cemeteries where chariots, horses, and bronze implements are interred alongside human remains, highlighting the association between martial capacity, ritual status, and community leadership. The geographic distribution of Santashta and Andronovo sites suggests a networked pattern of settlement connected by trade, pastoral movement, and ritual observance. Strategic placement along rivers and across steppe corridors facilitated communication, resource exchange, and coordination of seasonal migrations. Material culture indicates shared design motifs in pottery, weaponry, and architectural layouts, reflecting cultural cohesion across dispersed communities while allowing for local adaptation. These settlements demonstrate how technological innovation, mobility, and ritual practice were mutually reinforcing elements in Indo-Iranian society. Linguistic evidence reinforces the archaeological record. Proto-Indo-Iranian retains core elements of Proto-Indo-European grammar, while introducing innovations that reflect evolving social and religious structures. Reconstructed vocabulary includes terms for chariots, horses, ritual implements, and sacred sites, aligning with material culture. Comparative analysis of the Rigveda and Avesta indicates that these languages preserved both archaic features and early innovations, providing a timeline for migration and cultural development. The continuity of specialized terminology over centuries suggests sustained transmission of knowledge across mobile communities. The integration of chariot warfare and ritual practice had practical consequences for territorial expansion. The mobility afforded by wheeled vehicles and domesticated horses enabled Indo-Iranian groups to move seasonally across the steppes, establish outposts in new regions, and engage with neighboring populations. Archaeological evidence indicates that these movements were largely gradual and systematic rather than sudden invasions. Population diffusion, combined with shared linguistic and ritual frameworks, created conditions for the broader spread of Indo-Iranian culture into Central Asia, South Asia, and the Iranian plateau. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, the Indo-Iranian branch had crystallized as a distinct linguistic and cultural entity. Archaeological, linguistic, and ritual evidence demonstrates that Santashta and Andronovo communities provided the foundation for the migration of Indo-Aryan speakers into northern India and Iranian peoples into the Iranian plateau. Chariot technology, metallurgical expertise, and ritual practices underpinned social organization, while Proto-Indo-Iranian language served as the vehicle for transmitting knowledge, belief systems, and economic coordination across expansive steppe territories. Other Indo-European groups simultaneously moved westward into Europe, following different ecological and technological pathways. In contrast to the Indo-Iranian expansion, these Western migrations relied less on chariot warfare and ritual centralization, and more on mobility supported by cattle herding, wagons, and seasonal settlement patterns. The comparison of Eastern and Western trajectories illustrates the diversity of Indo-European dispersals while maintaining connections to shared linguistic and material origins in the Eurasian steppe. Authority rested in lineage and martial reputation. Early Indo-European political structures were organized around kin-based tribal confederations, in which leadership emerged from hereditary and personal prestige rather than formalized bureaucratic institutions. Archaeological and linguistic evidence indicates that these confederations spanned the Eurasian steppe, where mobility, pastoral economies, and limited settlement density constrained centralized administration. Leadership was exercised by warrior elites, whose status derived from skill in combat, control over livestock, and the ability to coordinate seasonal migrations and communal resources. Grave sites provide key insights into these early political arrangements. Burials from steppe cultures, including Khvalynsk, Sredny Stog, and later Yamnaya cemeteries, often feature high-status individuals interred with weapons, horse remains, and personal ornaments. These assemblages indicate the presence of a hierarchy grounded in martial capacity and resource control. The distribution of grave goods suggests that power was personal and localized rather than institutionalized, with leadership exercised within extended kin networks rather than across broad territorial jurisdictions. Social organization relied on lineage groups to maintain cohesion. Kinship determined access to land, herds, and ritual participation. Linguistic reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European vocabulary reveals terms for paternal relatives, clans, and hierarchical distinctions, reinforcing the archaeological picture of lineage-based authority. These groups coordinated labor for herding, resource management, and seasonal movement, ensuring the survival and resilience of mobile communities in a variable steppe environment. Military capacity was closely tied to political influence. Warrior elites enforced social norms, protected herds, and managed intergroup relations, including alliances and territorial negotiation. Archaeological evidence from fortified settlements, such as Archaeum in the southern Ural region, indicates that some confederations developed defensive infrastructure to secure both people and livestock. These structures, while limited in scale, suggest that tribal leadership included strategic and logistical responsibilities, particularly in regions of high competition for resources. Decision-making within tribal confederations was collective yet hierarchical. Assemblies of male kin likely convened to adjudicate disputes, allocate grazing land, and plan seasonal migration routes. Leadership was thus both personal and performative. Authority required recognition by the group and was contingent on demonstrated ability to protect, manage, and mobilize resources effectively. Linguistic evidence supports this model, with reconstructed terms for councils, elders, and chieftains appearing across Indo-European languages, suggesting the prevalence of consultative structures alongside hereditary influence. Trade and intergroup exchange reinforced the authority of warrior elites. Control over long-distance contacts for metals, amber, and livestock enabled leaders to consolidate influence beyond immediate kin groups. Archaeological findings, including bronze weapons and imported ornaments in elite graves, indicate that successful management of trade networks contributed directly to political stature. These networks also facilitated cultural cohesion, spreading shared practices in burial, metallurgy, and ritual across steppe regions. The tribal confederation model persisted across a range of ecological contexts. Mobility allowed leaders to maintain influence over dispersed groups while responding to environmental fluctuations and intergroup competition. Seasonal migration routes provided both economic stability and social integration, linking multiple kin units within broader confederations. Archaeological patterns show continuity of these structures over centuries, even as populations shifted geographically and new technologies, such as wagons and horses, enhanced mobility and logistical capacity. By the end of this period, Indo-European tribal confederations had developed a resilient model of governance rooted in kinship, martial leadership, and resource management. Authority remained personal and decentralized, constrained by environmental and social conditions. As settlement density increased and technology enabled more permanent occupation, the foundations of these confederations would support the emergence of more complex political structures, capable of coordinating larger populations and sustaining cultural expansion. Leadership merged ritual and command. In the early Indo-European world, the emergence of kingship represented a shift from decentralized tribal confederations to more formalized authority vested in individual rulers. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that these early kings combined martial leadership with sacral responsibilities, functioning as intermediaries between communities and the divine. Linguistic traces in Proto-Indo-European and its descendant languages reveal terms such as Rajan in Vedic Sanskrit, denoting both a political leader and a figure responsible for ritual oversight, suggesting that authority was inseparable from religious legitimacy. Hittite records provide one of the earliest textual attestations of sacral kingship outside South Asia. Royal archives from Hattusa document kings performing ritual ceremonies, offering sacrifices, and presiding over legal adjudications. These activities reinforce the king's position as both temporal and ritual authority, integrating governance with religious sanction. Material evidence, including monumental architecture, administrative tablets, and elite burial goods, reflects the concentration of resources and symbolic capital in the office of the ruler. The evolution of kingship involved increasing centralization of power over kin-based networks. While tribal elders and councils continued to play roles in decision-making, kings gained authority over land allocation, military organization, and economic regulation. Linguistic reconstruction suggests that Proto-Indo-European terms for chief and king conveyed both martial and ritual responsibilities, emphasizing the dual function of early rulers. This framework allowed rulers to maintain cohesion over increasingly mobile or geographically dispersed populations, linking governance to both social hierarchy and spiritual legitimacy. Archaeological patterns across Europe and the steppe indicate that kingship often emerged in regions of intensified settlement or trade. Control over economic resources, including pastures, livestock, and early metallurgical production, supported the king's ability to mobilize labor, equip warriors, and sponsor ritual activity. Excavated sites containing fortified settlements, high-status dwellings, and centralized storage facilities reveal the material underpinnings of authority. The combination of wealth, military capacity, and ritual visibility legitimized rulership in the eyes of both subordinate groups and rival communities. Ritual functions were not purely symbolic. Kings performed ceremonies that reinforced social cohesion, regulated conflict, and codified norms. Vedic and Hittite textual evidence illustrates that sacrificial rites, feasting, and ceremonial adjudication served as mechanisms for reaffirming loyalty and sanctioning authority. Linguistic evidence confirms that Proto-Indo-European vocabulary for ritual implements, sacred spaces, and ceremonial roles predates the historical manifestations of kingship, suggesting that the sacral component of leadership was foundational rather than derivative. Military capability remained a central pillar of early kingship. Kings oversaw the organization of mounted warriors and chariot units, coordinated seasonal defense strategies, and directed raids or territorial expansion when necessary. Archaeological finds, including weapon caches and horse burials associated with elite individuals, demonstrate that martial competence was inseparable from the king's authority. The integration of military leadership with ritual function ensured that kings could project both physical and symbolic power across the community. The consolidation of kingship also influenced legal and administrative development. Hittite and Vedic records indicate codification of norms, standardization of dispute resolution, and establishment of obligations among subjects. These administrative innovations allowed rulers to extend control beyond immediate kin networks, facilitating coordination of larger populations and more complex economic activity. Linguistic and textual evidence suggests that these structures were not fully bureaucratic but relied on the king's authority, ritual legitimacy, and personal oversight. By the conclusion of this period, early Indo-European kingship had established a model in which temporal, ritual, and military authority were interlinked. Leadership relied on visible control over resources, symbolic and ceremonial performance, and the capacity to mobilize and protect communities. The success of these early kings laid the foundation for the emergence of larger polities, in which authority depended not only on personal prestige but also on sustained economic support, administrative infrastructure, and broader social legitimacy. Political authority thus required economic support, forming the next stage in Indo-European state formation, where ritualized leadership was reinforced by productive and organizational capacity across increasingly complex societies. Long before cities or markets, Indo-European economies were shaped by mobility and livestock. Between approximately 4000 and 2500 BCE, communities on the Pontic-Caspian steppe relied primarily on mobile pastoralism as the foundation of their economic system. Archaeozoological evidence from sites associated with Khvalynsk, Sredny Stog, and Yamnaya cultures demonstrates a consistent emphasis on cattle, sheep, and horses. Herd composition and demographic profiles indicate selective breeding, rotational grazing, and careful seasonal management, suggesting that mobility was not incidental but a deliberate strategy for optimizing resource use across expansive grasslands. Settlement patterns support this interpretation. Excavations reveal semi-permanent dwellings and temporary campsites distributed along river valleys and steppe corridors, allowing herders to exploit both winter pastures and summer grazing lands. Archaeological layers show repeated occupation with minimal permanent architecture, emphasizing flexibility in subsistence and social organization. These patterns contrast sharply with contemporary sedentary agricultural sites to the south, highlighting the steppe economy's reliance on animal husbandry as the central subsistence mode. Proto-Indo-European linguistic reconstruction provides complementary evidence for the economic priorities of these societies. Reconstructed vocabulary includes terms for livestock management, such as cattle, guz, sheep, h2os, horses, hekvos, and specific herding tasks. Lexical items associated with dairy production, including milking and cheesemaking, indicate specialized knowledge transmitted across generations. This alignment between linguistic and material evidence confirms that pastoralism was not merely subsistence-oriented but incorporated structured labor practices, resource tracking, and knowledge of herd dynamics. Pastoral economies on the steppe were supplemented, rather than supplanted, by limited agriculture. Archaeobotanical remains indicate cultivation of cereals such as barley and wheat in marginal river valleys. But these crops were peripheral to the main economic strategy. The predominance of herding over farming reflects environmental constraints, including the steppe's variable rainfall, exposure to frost, and expansive grasslands unsuitable for intensive agriculture. Pastoralism thus provided a resilient economic base capable of sustaining populations in a fluctuating ecological context. Horses played a pivotal role in optimizing pastoral mobility. By combining herd management with riding and traction technologies, steppe communities could monitor and move animals across broad seasonal circuits. Isotopic analyses of animal remains suggest structured rotational grazing, while bit wear and skeletal studies confirm that horses were used both for herding and transport. This integration of animal labor, seasonal migration, and settlement flexibility allowed communities to maintain stable subsistence while mitigating risk from climate variation or resource scarcity. Economic flexibility also enabled demographic expansion. Mobile pastoralism supported population dispersal without the necessity of dense infrastructure or permanent settlements. The steppe's ecological corridors, coupled with herd-based subsistence, allowed communities to occupy large territories while maintaining cohesion through kinship networks. Archaeological surveys indicate repeated patterns of occupation across hundreds of kilometers, demonstrating that mobility itself was a structural advantage, facilitating the spread of cultural and linguistic traits. The organization of labor and resource management further reinforced economic stability. Herds were likely divided among family or kin groups, with specific roles assigned for grazing, milking, and care of young animals. Linguistic evidence for terms designating roles, tools, and seasonal labor indicates that Proto-Indo-European communities maintained structured systems for coordinating work. These practices ensured that herding, dairy production, and animal movement could be efficiently managed across dispersed and mobile groups. Pastoralism also underpinned the emergence of early exchange networks. Surpluses of livestock, dairy products, and secondary animal goods, such as hides and wool, could be traded over long distances along river corridors and steppe routes. Evidence of bronze implements, pottery, and ornaments in distant sites demonstrates that mobile herders participated in exchange systems extending beyond immediate kin groups. These networks allowed steppe communities to access materials unavailable locally while reinforcing social alliances and facilitating cultural cohesion. By the end of this phase, pastoral economies had established a stable and resilient foundation for Indo-European societies. Mobility, herd management, and strategic use of seasonal pastures enabled communities to sustain populations, expand territorially, and support emerging social hierarchies. Linguistic, archaeozoological, and settlement evidence collectively demonstrate that pastoralism was a deliberate, structured, and adaptive system rather than a simple precursor to sedentary agriculture. As production stabilized and surplus management became feasible, these communities began developing long-distance exchange networks. The capacity to move goods, animals, and resources across the steppe laid the groundwork for broader economic integration, setting the stage for intensified trade, metallurgical specialization, and the emergence of proto-urban nodes in subsequent centuries. Pastoralism, therefore, functioned not merely as a subsistence strategy but as a structural basis for demographic, technological, and cultural expansion. Metalworking altered social power long before it transformed warfare. Beginning in the late 4th millennium BCE, Indo-European associated cultures such as Khvalynsk, Yamnaya, and later Khordad where communities began producing copper and early bronze artifacts, signaling the emergence of localized metallurgy as both a technological and social driver. Archaeological excavations demonstrate that these communities operated small-scale workshops, often within settlements or burial contexts, producing weapons, ornaments, and tools that were distributed across kin groups and ceremonial sites. The concentration of metal artifacts in elite graves indicates that access to these technologies was regulated, reinforcing emerging social hierarchies. Evidence for early metallurgical activity includes slag deposits, molds, and finished implements recovered from Khvalynsk and Yamnaya sites. Analysis of alloy composition shows that artisans had a practical understanding of copper-tin ratios, suggesting experimentation and skill transfer across generations. Grave goods, including copper axes, ornamental pins, and early bronze weapons, are disproportionately associated with high-status individuals, demonstrating the role of metallurgy in materializing prestige. The ability to commission, control, or produce metal objects enhanced political authority and social influence within otherwise kin-based communities. Linguistic reconstruction provides complementary evidence for the spread and standardization of metallurgical knowledge. Proto-Indo-European terms for metals, tools, and related processes, including words for copper, ados, bronze, and axes, appear consistently across descendant languages. These shared lexemes suggest that knowledge of metalworking diffused across speech communities, facilitating technological continuity even as groups dispersed geographically. Such lexical evidence indicates that metallurgy was embedded in the cultural and linguistic frameworks of early Indo-European societies. The integration of metallurgy into ritual and symbolic spheres further reinforced social stratification. Metal objects were not purely functional. Many were included in burial rites, sacrificial deposits, and ceremonial caches. The selective inclusion of weapons and ornaments in graves conveyed status, underscored control over specialized knowledge, and symbolically linked craftsmanship to leadership. Archaeological analysis of corded ware and santashta burials demonstrates that metal artifacts functioned as markers of prestige, reinforcing the authority of warrior and ritual elites. Production was decentralized yet sophisticated. Archaeological layers show that metalworking occurred at multiple sites rather than in centralized workshops, indicating that knowledge was distributed among skilled artisans embedded within communities. This organization allowed for flexibility in supply, ensured continuity of craft traditions, and prevented monopolization by a single political authority. The decentralized nature of production also aligned with kin-based and tribal structures, where mastery of technology conferred prestige without requiring formal bureaucracy. Metallurgy intersected with broader economic and social networks. Copper and bronze objects were exchanged across settlements, often moving along river corridors and steppe routes that also facilitated pastoral mobility. These exchanges strengthened alliances between communities and reinforced social cohesion. The control of metallurgy, therefore, was not merely technical but deeply embedded in the social economy, linking craft specialization to political legitimacy, wealth accumulation, and ceremonial authority. The emergence of specialized production encouraged complementary trade connections. Communities that mastered metallurgy became nodes in expanding networks of exchange, distributing surplus metal objects and obtaining raw materials, such as tin and copper ores, from distant sources. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that such trade facilitated technological diffusion, standardization of artifact forms, and regional cohesion among dispersed Indo-European groups. The interplay between mobility, production, and exchange underpinned the development of complex steppe societies, while maintaining kin-based social organization. By the end of this period, metallurgy had become a key structural element of Indo-European societies. The production and control of metal goods reinforced hierarchy, allowed the emergence of ritual and martial elites, and connected communities through economic and cultural exchange. Linguistic, archaeological, and material evidence collectively demonstrates that early metallurgy was both a technical innovation and a social instrument, enabling power and prestige to accrue to individuals and families within kin-based networks. Specialized production of copper and bronze. Artifacts set the stage for the intensification of long-distance exchange networks, linking steppe pastoralists to wider Eurasian circuits. These networks facilitated the flow of raw materials, finished tools, and symbolic objects, contributing to cultural cohesion and technological continuity. Metallurgy thus acted as both a practical and social catalyst, transforming early Indo-European societies by embedding technological skill within systems of status, ritual, and economic interconnection. Despite geographic separation, Indo-European religions preserved a shared cosmic grammar. Comparative linguistic and mythological studies allow scholars to reconstruct aspects of Proto-Indo-European, PIE cosmology, revealing a worldview structured around divine hierarchies, natural forces, and human obligation. Central figures include the Sky Father, Darius Ph2tr, who appears in Vedic, Greek, and Latin traditions, storm and warrior deities, often associated with order and martial protection, and earth goddesses, linked to fertility and cyclical renewal. These recurring motifs suggest that early Indo-Europeans conceived of a cosmos in which hierarchical order and reciprocity governed both the natural and human spheres. Archaeological evidence provides complementary support for these reconstructions. Ritual deposits, such as votive offerings of animals, weapons, or ceramics, have been documented at Yamnaya and related steppe sites. The placement of graves and alignment of burials along cardinal axes indicate a concern with cosmic orientation, potentially reflecting early cosmological concepts. While no single practice was uniform across all communities, these material markers show systematic engagement with spatial and symbolic order, consistent with reconstructed religious vocabulary. Linguistic reconstruction clarifies key conceptual categories. PIE terminology includes words for sacred, offering, and ritual space, as well as specific roles such as priests or ritual specialists. Shared lexical roots appear in later Indo-European languages, providing evidence that the underlying concepts were widely recognized and transmitted among steppe populations before their dispersal. For instance, reconstructed terms for fire and water rituals appear both in Vedic Sanskrit and in Hittite ritual texts, implying continuity in the semantic field of ceremonial action. The cosmological system also integrated natural phenomena and social organization. Sky and storm deities functioned as guarantors of order and protection, while earth goddesses were linked to sustenance and fertility. This division reflects a conceptual symmetry between celestial authority and terrestrial productivity, suggesting that early Indo-European belief systems connected ritual practice with environmental observation and agricultural cycles. Archaeological indications of seasonal feasting, animal sacrifice, and structured burial alignments reinforce this interpretation, showing that cosmology guided communal behavior and ritual timing. Social hierarchy and religious practice were intertwined. Ritual specialists or elite families likely mediated between the human and divine realms, maintaining ceremonial knowledge, conducting offerings, and ensuring compliance with cosmic norms. Linguistic and comparative mythological evidence indicates that authority derived legitimacy in part from the ability to perform and oversee proper rituals, linking governance with cosmological principles. This integration of social and divine order contributed to the durability of hierarchical structures observed in later Indo-European societies. Although variation existed between regions, the shared cosmic grammar provided a framework for cultural cohesion. Concepts such as divine kingship, sacred fire, and ritualized reciprocity persisted across disparate groups, offering continuity despite geographic and temporal separation. Archaeological patterns, including repeated motifs in grave goods, ceremonial deposits, and alignment practices, corroborate the idea that these symbolic structures were meaningful across steppe and peripheral regions. By situating humans within a hierarchical, ordered cosmos, Proto-Indo-European cosmology shaped the conduct of ritual, social organization, and moral expectation. Ritual behavior was not arbitrary. It reflected an understanding of reciprocity with divine forces, ensuring social cohesion and environmental attunement. This conceptual framework influenced subsequent Indo-European religious systems, from Vedic India and Hittite Anatolia to classical Europe, providing a foundation for the evolution of complex theological and ceremonial traditions. Cosmology, therefore, was not merely abstract thought but an active structure guiding human activity, linking ritual, social hierarchy, and environmental observation. These principles would inform the organization of cultic practices, the roles of ritual specialists, and the symbolic underpinnings of political and social authority. Ritual served both divine and social functions. Among early Indo-European societies, ceremonial practices, including animal sacrifice, libations, and communal feasting, were central to maintaining social cohesion, legitimizing leadership, and reinforcing hierarchical structures. Archaeological evidence from Yamnaya, Santashta, and corded-ware sites demonstrates the deliberate deposition of animal bones, pottery, and specialized implements, suggesting structured ritual activity. These material traces align with later textual and ethnographic sources, such as Vedic hymns, Roman sacrificial rites, and Germanic ceremonial accounts, indicating continuity in the organization and purpose of rituals across time and space. Animal sacrifice played a critical role in both religious and social regulation. Skeletal remains from steppe cemeteries indicate selective slaughter of cattle, sheep, and horses, often with evidence of butchery in designated ceremonial contexts. Such offerings served to mediate relationships between human communities and divine forces, symbolically transferring resources and reaffirming cosmic order. At the same time, the distribution of meat in feasting contexts strengthened social bonds, provided material reward to participants, and visibly reinforced the authority of elite or ritual specialists responsible for organizing ceremonies. Libations, including the pouring of milk, fermented beverages, or water, were integral to the performance of ritual. Archaeological finds, such as standardized drinking vessels and traces of organic residues, suggest that these practices were codified within ceremonial routines. Linguistic reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European ritual vocabulary indicates specialized terminology for libations, sacrificial acts, and sacred spaces, demonstrating that these activities were socially recognized and widely transmitted among dispersed steppe communities. The consistency of these terms in later Indo-European languages points to the long-standing importance of such practices in reinforcing communal norms. Feasting reinforced hierarchy and facilitated the display of wealth and status. Elite control over surplus livestock, food, and ceremonial objects allowed leaders to distribute resources selectively, consolidating loyalty and authority. Excavated hearths and communal enclosures at Santashta and corded-ware sites reveal large-scale preparation and consumption of animal products, consistent with the coordination of ritualized meals. These gatherings provided occasions for social negotiation, conflict resolution, and ceremonial observance, integrating the practical and symbolic dimensions of ritual activity. Ritual organization required defined institutional roles. Linguistic evidence indicates Proto-Indo-European terms for priests, ritual overseers, and ceremonial assistants, suggesting that specialized knowledge was concentrated in individuals or families with social responsibility for maintaining ritual norms. These roles facilitated the transmission of technical expertise, ensured proper performance of ceremonial acts, and codified the relationship between religious authority and social hierarchy. Archaeological data, including distinctive burial goods and symbolic implements, corroborate the existence of recognized ritual specialists within steppe communities. Comparative evidence demonstrates that while practices varied geographically, the underlying structure of ritual remained consistent. The sequence of offering, consumption, and redistribution observed in Vedic, Roman, and Germanic contexts mirrors archaeological patterns in steppe societies. This continuity implies that ritual acted as a social and ideological framework, regulating behavior, mediating authority, and integrating dispersed communities without requiring centralized bureaucratic institutions. Ritual thus functioned as both a symbolic expression of belief and a mechanism for maintaining order within and between kin-based networks. By systematically linking ceremonial acts to social hierarchy, early Indo-European rituals reinforced both the cosmological worldview and material authority. Sacrificial practices, libations, and feasting created predictable, observable structures that confirmed leadership legitimacy, facilitated cooperation, and transmitted cultural norms across generations. The integration of ritual and social order ensured that ideological cohesion accompanied mobility, economic activity, and emerging political structures. Religious authority, therefore, depended on clearly defined roles and expertise, forming the basis for the next stage of institutionalization. The codification of ritual knowledge and its alignment with elite leadership would provide the foundation for priesthoods, sacred offices, and ceremonial oversight, linking ideological control to the broader functioning of early Indo-European societies. Weapons marked authority as much as conflict. Archaeological evidence from steppe societies associated with early Indo-Europeans, including Yamnaya, Sintashta, and Corded-ware cultures, demonstrates that warrior elites occupied a distinct social tier within kin-based and emerging hierarchical structures. Grave assemblages frequently contain swords, axes, daggers, and arrowheads interred alongside horses, chariots, or ceremonial objects. These deposits indicate that martial capability was closely tied to social prestige, political influence, and lineage, rather than existing solely for functional combat purposes. The role of weaponry extended beyond practical use in warfare. Elaborate weapon sets, often of bronze or early iron, symbolized authority and the capacity to defend kin groups, control resources, and command loyalty. The presence of weapons in burials correlates with other markers of status, including ornate personal adornments, horse burials, and specialized grave construction. Such patterns suggest that warrior elites exercised authority through a combination of martial skill, symbolic capital, and ceremonial recognition. Mobility was a critical component of elite status. Horse domestication and the use of chariots allowed leaders to project power across extensive territories, monitor pastoral resources, and coordinate seasonal movements. Archaeological evidence, including bitware on horse remains and wheel ruts near settlements, indicates that mounted mobility and vehicular transport were essential for both military strategy and social control. This enhanced mobility reinforced the social position of warrior elites, who could oversee dispersed communities and respond rapidly to both threats and opportunities. Control of resources underpinned martial authority. Elite burials frequently include metal weapons, ornaments, and items produced through specialized crafts such as metallurgy and leatherworking. Linguistic reconstruction provides Proto-Indo-European terminology for weapons, armor, and martial roles, reflecting the cultural integration of combat and status. Access to these resources was likely regulated within kin groups, consolidating influence and reinforcing hierarchical distinctions. Ritual practices further solidified the symbolic role of weapons. Funerary rites often included the placement of weaponry alongside human and animal remains, integrating martial prestige into broader cosmological and social frameworks. Comparative evidence from later Indo-European traditions, such as Vedic India and early European cultures, indicates continuity in associating martial implements with both sacred and social authority. Weapons thus functioned as markers of identity, legitimacy, and control within steppe societies. By the end of this period, warrior elites were clearly differentiated from ordinary members of their communities. Martial skill, access to resources, and ceremonial recognition combined to define a socially recognized class whose authority extended beyond immediate kinship. These elite roles established the foundation for more complex political and military structures, where leadership increasingly depended on the capacity to mobilize troops, control trade or tribute, and maintain social cohesion. Mobility enhanced military reach, enabling elites to command dispersed populations, respond to seasonal demands, and project influence over wide areas. This combination of martial skill, symbolic authority, and logistical capability would underpin later expansions of Indo-European groups across Eurasia, shaping patterns of settlement, warfare, and cultural transmission that persisted for centuries. Speed reshaped battlefield dynamics. By approximately 2000 BCE, chariotry had emerged as a transformative military technology among Indo-Iranian and steppe-associated Indo-European groups. Archaeological evidence from Sintashta, Andronovo, and related cultures demonstrates sophisticated wheel and axle construction, specialized harnessing systems, and horse-drawn vehicles capable of rapid mobility across the steppe. Chariots allowed for strategic advantages in reconnaissance, rapid troop deployment, and shock combat, altering the tactical calculus of both local conflicts and wider territorial engagements. Chariots were more than instruments of warfare. They symbolized social and ritual prestige. Elite burials in Santashta settlements often include chariots interred alongside horses, weapons, and metal ornaments, indicating that mastery of this technology was closely linked to authority. Linguistic reconstructions from Proto-Indo-Iranian suggest specialized terminology for chariot components, horses, and related martial actions, reflecting the cultural centrality of these vehicles in both practical and ceremonial contexts. Ownership or command of a chariot conferred both social recognition and military capability. The integration of chariots into steppe military systems increased mobility and operational reach. Groups equipped with chariots could traverse hundreds of kilometers seasonally, coordinate herding, control trade routes, and respond rapidly to intergroup competition. Archaeozoological studies confirm that horses used for chariot traction were selectively bred for speed and endurance, reinforcing the interdependence of animal husbandry, technology, and military organization. This combination of mobility and tactical innovation allowed elite warriors to dominate regional landscapes efficiently. Tactical deployment relied on both vehicle design and organizational skill. Chariots typically carried two occupants, a driver and an archer or spearman, allowing simultaneous maneuvering and projectile combat. Archaeological reconstructions indicate lightweight wooden frames with spoked wheels, optimized for speed rather than heavy protection. Such designs facilitated rapid strikes, flanking maneuvers, and control of open terrain, providing decisive advantages against slower, foot-based opponents. The presence of chariot burials across multiple sites indicates that this capability was institutionalized within elite military units, rather than sporadic or experimental. Ritual significance reinforced the strategic role of chariots. Chariot burials, combined with weapons and animal offerings, underscored the intersection of martial skill, social rank, and ceremonial legitimacy. Comparative evidence from the Rigveda and early Iranian texts suggests that chariots were central to both combat narratives and ritualized feasts or offerings, linking battlefield prowess to cosmological and social frameworks. This dual role highlights the integration of technology, ideology, and hierarchy in early Indo-European societies. The adoption of chariotry intensified competition and intergroup conflict. Groups with chariots could project power over larger territories, dominate seasonal pastures, and influence trade and alliance networks. Archaeological patterns indicate that fortified settlements and elite cemeteries often coincide with chariot use, suggesting that control of mobility and technology directly affected political and military outcomes. This innovation also contributed to the emergence of more centralized authority, as leaders capable of mobilizing chariot units commanded both loyalty and resources across dispersed communities. By the end of this period, chariots had become a defining feature of Indo-Iranian military organization and social prestige. They transformed tactical engagement, enhanced elite authority, and reinforced the interdependence of technology, mobility, and ritual. The integration of chariots into steppe warfare provided a foundation for wider expansions, setting the stage for the subsequent intensification of cultural and territorial influence across Eurasia. Expansion and technological innovation would continue to reshape political and economic landscapes, connecting mobility, military capability, and social hierarchy into a system capable of sustained growth and cultural transmission. Indo-European systems reached bureaucratic maturity. By the first millennium BCE, several classical civilizations had institutionalized linguistic, legal, and administrative frameworks derived from earlier Indo-European traditions. In Greece, Rome, Persia, and the Vedic kingdoms of South Asia, language, governance, and codified law became integral to state functioning, reflecting the culmination of centuries of social, political, and technological development. These civilizations demonstrate how Indo-European structural principles, hierarchical leadership, ritual legitimacy, and resource management were translated into complex, centralized states capable of sustaining large populations and coordinated economies. Greek city-states exemplified the codification of civic, legal, and military structures. Texts such as Homeric epics, coupled with archaeological evidence from palatial and civic centers, indicate that social hierarchies and warrior elites evolved into bureaucratic institutions. Magistracies, councils, and codified laws formalized authority that had previously been exercised through lineage and martial prestige. Military organization, including hoplite phalanxes and naval command, reflects systematic coordination, linking social rank with state service. In Rome, Indo-European-derived governance and legal systems reached full bureaucratic expression. Latin terminology, administrative titles, and procedural norms reveal continuity with earlier steppe social concepts, adapted to urbanized, agrarian societies. Written codes such as the 12 Tables formalized legal expectations, while the Roman cursus honorum institutionalized pathways of political authority. Monumental architecture and infrastructural projects, including roads and aqueducts, demonstrate the scale of resource management necessary to support extensive populations and centralized governance. Persian empires, particularly the Achaemenid dynasty, integrated Indo-European models of kingship with sophisticated administrative networks. Royal inscriptions, such as the Behistun inscription, detail hierarchical governance, tribute systems, and provincial oversight. The centralization of authority, coupled with delegated satrapal administration, illustrates the adaptation of steppe-derived concepts of leadership to multi-ethnic, expansive territories. Military organization, standardized taxation, and regulated trade facilitated the coherence and durability of the empire. In South Asia, the Vedic kingdoms institutionalized earlier Indo-European social and ritual structures. The Vedic texts codified the roles of kings, priests, and warriors within an organized socio-religious framework. Ritual knowledge, economic oversight, and military leadership were integrated into governance, reflecting continuity from Proto-Indo-European principles of sacral kingship, elite coordination, and resource management. These practices provided the institutional foundation for subsequent Mauryan and post-Vedic state systems. Language played a central role in consolidating administrative and ideological coherence across these civilizations. Indo-European linguistic structures were adapted to written forms, enabling standardized record-keeping, codification of law, and transmission of ritual knowledge. Lexical continuity in terms for governance, ritual, and legal process demonstrates the persistence of conceptual categories originating in steppe societies. Writing, combined with organizational innovation, allowed these civilizations to manage extensive territories while maintaining social and religious cohesion. Military systems in classical civilizations reflect the evolution of steppe-based hierarchical and tactical innovations. Elite warrior traditions, mounted and chariot warfare, and coordinated infantry units were institutionalized within standing armies. The integration of mobility, technology, and organizational hierarchy enabled sustained campaigns, territorial expansion, and enforcement of administrative authority. Archaeological evidence, including fortifications, weapon caches, and logistical infrastructure, confirms that classical armies were both professionalized and embedded within broader political and social systems. By the culmination of these developments, Indo-European influence had extended beyond language, ritual, and military organization into full-scale administrative, economic, and legal integration. Bureaucratic structures, codified laws, and institutionalized social hierarchies represented the peak of Indo-European systemic influence, demonstrating how steppe-derived principles were adapted to urbanized, multi-ethnic, and literate societies. This phase marked the consolidation of earlier technological, ideological, and social innovations into enduring state-level institutions. The classical civilizations thus illustrate the apex of Indo-European organizational capacity. Their systems of governance, ritual authority, law, and military coordination reflect centuries of cumulative adaptation, connecting pastoral and martial origins with urbanized bureaucratic states. Influence extended beyond language, law, and administration, shaping cultural norms, ideological frameworks, and regional integration that persisted across Eurasia for centuries. Language outlasted political power. By the first millennium BCE, Indo-European languages had spread across vast regions of Eurasia, becoming the primary medium of administration, culture, and social organization for multiple civilizations. From the Greek city-states and Roman Republic to the Persian satrapies and Vedic kingdoms, Indo-European linguistic frameworks provided continuity across diverse political contexts. Archaeological, epigraphic, and textual evidence demonstrates that language functioned as both a tool of governance and a vessel for preserving shared conceptual structures, including law, ritual, and social hierarchy. The spread of Greek and Latin exemplifies the consolidation of linguistic influence. In the Mediterranean, inscriptions, administrative tablets, and literary texts show how language structured civic, legal, and religious life. Greek functioned not only as a means of communication but as a vehicle for codifying philosophical, scientific, and literary knowledge. Latin similarly formalized administrative systems, legal codes, and military commands, enabling cohesion across the Roman Republic and later the Empire. In both cases, linguistic standardization reinforced hierarchical authority while facilitating integration of distant provinces and culturally diverse populations. Persian administrations adapted Indo-European linguistic structures for imperial oversight. Old Persian cuneiform, as seen in the Behistun inscription, codified royal decrees, tribute obligations, and provincial responsibilities. Linguistic uniformity allowed the central government to communicate with satraps and subordinate elites, ensuring compliance across a multi-ethnic empire. The standardization of terminology for governance, taxation, and ritual mirrored steppe-derived Indo-European conceptual patterns, demonstrating continuity between pastoral origins and bureaucratic application. In South Asia, Sanskrit preserved linguistic structures directly traceable to Proto-Indo-European. Vedic texts codified religious practice, ritual formulae, and social hierarchies, maintaining cultural cohesion across disparate polities. Written and oral transmission ensured the continuity of elite knowledge, including law, sacrificial procedures, and social norms. Linguistic evidence reveals that even as political control shifted between dynasties, the underlying Indo-European frameworks persisted, shaping successive state structures throughout the subcontinent. The dominance of Indo-European languages facilitated cultural and administrative integration across regions. Standardized vocabularies allowed elites to coordinate ritual, military, and economic functions across geographically dispersed communities. Linguistic markers for kinship, governance, and sacred practice provided continuity despite differences in local custom or political configuration. This capacity for conceptual and administrative transmission was a defining factor in the endurance of Indo-European cultural patterns over centuries and across multiple civilizations. Linguistic dominance also enabled the codification and preservation of intellectual and ritual knowledge. Textual traditions, inscriptions, and literary works maintained continuity of law, cosmology, and social hierarchy. Greek philosophical treatises, Roman legal codes, Persian royal inscriptions, and Vedic hymns all exemplify how Indo-European languages functioned as repositories of shared knowledge, transmitting complex ideas across time and space. These textual artifacts allow modern scholars to trace both continuity and divergence in cultural practice across the Eurasian continent. The persistence of language beyond political or military decline underscores its structural significance. Even when empires fragmented, their Indo-European linguistic heritage endured, shaping successor states and influencing emergent polities. Latin persisted in ecclesiastical, legal, and scholarly contexts long after the fall of Rome. Sanskrit remained a medium of ritual and administration in South Asia. This durability demonstrates that linguistic frameworks were not merely communicative tools but essential instruments for organizing social, political, and ideological life. By the end of this period, Indo-European languages had achieved dominance across Eurasia, extending from the Mediterranean to the Indian subcontinent. Their influence permeated administration, ritual, literature, and intellectual culture, ensuring the preservation of institutional and social continuity, even in the absence of centralized political authority. Language became the primary vector through which Indo-European structural principles, hierarchical governance, ritualized authority, and codified law were transmitted across generations. Institutions, law, and ritual, mediated through these languages, preserved cultural continuity and reinforced social cohesion. Linguistic dominance allowed Indo-European ideas to persist long after empires dissolved, demonstrating the enduring capacity of speech communities to encode, transmit, and institutionalize complex social, political, and religious structures across space and time. Unity dissolved gradually. By the first millennium BCE, Indo-European communities experienced significant regional divergence as environmental, demographic, and political pressures reshaped shared traditions. Climatic fluctuations, including shifts in rainfall and steppe productivity, influenced settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, and migration routes. Archaeological surveys indicate that previously interconnected networks of pastoralists and early settlements fragmented into localized systems, reflecting adaptation to distinct ecological zones. Differences in resource availability and terrain encouraged specialized economic practices, from pastoralism in the open steppe to mixed agriculture in river valleys, contributing to the emergence of divergent social structures. Political fragmentation reinforced these environmental pressures. The rise of centralized states, fortified settlements, and interregional conflict reduced the cohesion of steppe-based kin networks. Archaeological evidence shows the proliferation of smaller, discrete communities, often distinguished by regional ceramic styles, burial practices, and metallurgical traditions. Linguistic data corroborates these trends, with early dialectical differentiation documented in both Indo-Iranian and European branches, suggesting that geographic separation and social isolation accelerated the development of distinct languages and local identities. Religious and ritual practices also began to diverge. While shared Proto-Indo-European cosmological motifs persisted, the expression of these beliefs adapted to regional circumstances. Excavated ritual deposits demonstrate variation in animal offerings, sacrificial rites, and sacred architecture, reflecting local environmental constraints and socio-political contexts. Comparative studies of Vedic, Hittite, Celtic, and Germanic traditions reveal that while underlying structures, such as hierarchical deities, ritual specialists, and sacrificial frameworks, remained recognizable, the specifics of practice became increasingly localized. Social hierarchy evolved in response to both environmental and political factors. Communities adapted leadership structures to smaller-scale settlements, emphasizing localized authority rather than long-range coordination. Elite status became increasingly tied to control over specific resources or strategic trade routes rather than overarching kin networks. Archaeological evidence from cemeteries and fortified sites shows regional differentiation in grave goods, burial architecture, and associated symbols of authority, illustrating that political power was being redefined along local lines. Trade and material culture were similarly affected. As networks fragmented, exchange became more regionally focused, relying on proximate sources for metals, ceramics, and livestock. Nonetheless, evidence of long-distance contacts, such as bronze axes or ornaments found far from their point of origin, indicates that some interregional interaction persisted, albeit in reduced form. The distribution of such items highlights the selective retention of connectivity alongside increasing regional specialization. Linguistic divergence paralleled these material and social changes. Dialects developed distinctive phonetic, morphological, and lexical features, laying the groundwork for the emergence of fully independent Indo-European languages. Comparative philology demonstrates that separation of Anatolian, Tocharian, Celtic, Italic, and Indo-Iranian branches coincided with patterns of geographic isolation and community differentiation. This process illustrates how environmental and political pressures shaped both cultural practice and linguistic evolution simultaneously. By the end of this period, what had once been a broadly cohesive network of Proto-Indo-European traditions had fragmented into regionally distinct societies. Core principles, hierarchical leadership, ritual structure, and pastoral or agrarian adaptation remained, but they were expressed differently according to local conditions. The combination of ecological adaptation, political decentralization, and emerging trade limitations fostered diverse trajectories, setting the stage for the development of independent Indo-European civilizations across Europe and Asia. New identities emerged from these divergent paths. communities began to define themselves through localized language, ritual practices, material culture, and territorial control. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that these emergent identities facilitated both social cohesion within regions and competitive interaction between groups. This transformation marked a critical transition from a network of culturally related steppe populations to a mosaic of differentiated Indo-European societies, each capable of pursuing its own political, economic, and ritual strategies. Regional divergence, therefore, represents a structural pivot in Indo-European history. Environmental pressures, political decentralization, and evolving social hierarchies combined to fragment previously shared traditions, producing localized adaptations in language, religion, and material culture. These processes not only reshaped steppe societies but also laid the foundation for the complex, regionally distinct civilizations that would dominate Eurasia in the subsequent centuries. Adaptation ensured survival. As Indo-European groups migrated and settled in diverse ecological and cultural zones during the first millennium BCE, they increasingly absorbed local traditions, producing hybrid social, religious, and material systems. Archaeological evidence from Central Europe, the Mediterranean, and South Asia demonstrates the integration of steppe-derived Indo-European practices with pre-existing local cultures. Material culture, burial practices, and ritual paraphernalia reflect a deliberate combination of inherited traditions and indigenous innovations, suggesting that cultural flexibility was central to sustaining social cohesion in new environments. Trade, intermarriage, and political alliances facilitated this synthesis. Steppe populations interacted with sedentary agricultural communities, exchanging technologies, livestock, and symbolic motifs. For example, in Central Europe, corded ware and bell beaker settlements exhibit a combination of Indo-European burial rites with local ceramic styles and architectural forms. Similarly, in the Indian subcontinent, early Vedic communities incorporated agricultural techniques, riverine resource management, and indigenous ritual elements into their existing steppe-derived frameworks. These processes demonstrate that cultural persistence depended not solely on the retention of original traditions but on the selective incorporation of external practices. Religious and ideological systems were particularly dynamic. While Proto-Indo-European cosmological structures provided a foundational framework, local deities, ritual forms, and ceremonial objects were incorporated into Indo-European ritual life. Archaeological evidence shows syncretic temple sites, hybrid iconography, and combined sacrificial practices. Comparative textual studies, such as Vedic hymns and Hittite religious records, indicate that ritual vocabularies and cosmological concepts were retained even as local forms were assimilated, preserving ideological continuity while facilitating adaptation to new socio-cultural contexts. Material culture also reflects this integrative process. Weaponry, tools, pottery, and ornamental objects often display hybridized design, combining steppe motifs with indigenous styles. Metallurgical analysis demonstrates that alloying techniques and decorative methods were sometimes adapted from local traditions, producing artifacts that were functionally and symbolically effective in regional contexts. This exchange of material knowledge reinforced both economic and social networks, linking incoming Indo-European populations with established communities while consolidating elite authority. Language served as both a vector for Indo-European continuity and a site of adaptation. While core Proto-Indo-European vocabulary persisted in areas such as ritual terminology, kinship, and governance, contact with local populations introduced new lexical items, phonetic shifts, and syntactic variations. Epigraphic evidence in Anatolia, Central Europe, and South Asia shows the development of regional dialects and the early formation of independent Indo-European languages. These linguistic transformations reflect the capacity of Indo-European communities to integrate local influences without abandoning foundational structures. Social hierarchies adapted alongside cultural integration. Elite families maintained authority by combining inherited steppe norms with regionally recognized markers of prestige. Burial practices, ceremonial feasts, and elite distribution of goods reflect the negotiation between tradition and local expectation. In many contexts, Leaders drew legitimacy from both ancestral Indo-European lineage and successful engagement with indigenous customs, facilitating social cohesion and political stability in newly settled areas. By the end of this period, cultural synthesis had produced distinct, regionally adapted Indo-European societies across Eurasia. Core ideological, linguistic, and social principles persisted, but they were expressed through hybridized material, ritual, and administrative forms. This process of selective adaptation ensured the resilience of Indo-European systems in the face of environmental, demographic, and political pressures. Proto-systems gradually faded as discrete, hybridized cultures emerged. Steppe-derived institutions of governance, ritual, and social hierarchy were integrated into local contexts, producing civilizations that retained Indo-European structural principles while reflecting regional innovation. Archaeological, linguistic, and textual evidence collectively demonstrates that cultural synthesis was not passive but an active process of adaptation, enabling Indo-European societies to survive, expand, and exert influence across diverse regions. Ancient words still shape modern thought. Indo-European societies left a profound linguistic and cultural legacy, visible across contemporary Europe, South Asia, and parts of the Near East. Modern languages, including English, Spanish, Russian, Persian, and Hindi, retain vocabulary, grammatical structures, and conceptual categories traceable to Proto-Indo-European origins. Linguistic reconstruction demonstrates that fundamental terms related to kinship, ritual, social hierarchy, agriculture, and technology have persisted across millennia, providing continuity in how communities categorize the natural and social world. The Indo-European lexicon extends beyond practical vocabulary to include abstract and conceptual domains. Words for familial relationships, governance, celestial bodies, and sacred practices reveal that Proto-Indo-European speakers developed structured cognitive frameworks capable of supporting complex social organization. Comparative linguistics shows that these frameworks informed subsequent literary, legal, and religious traditions. For example, kinship terminology in Sanskrit and Latin reflects the organizational principles of steppe-based lineages, while religious vocabulary in Greek, Hittite, and Vedic texts preserves conceptual continuity with Proto-Indo-European cosmology and ritual practice. Material culture and ritual forms also influenced later societies. Steppe-derived burial practices, sacrificial norms, and elite feasting traditions informed ceremonial structures in early European, Iranian, and South Asian civilizations. Archaeological continuity is observable in the arrangement of graves, deposition of grave goods, and symbolic use of horses and chariots. These patterns demonstrate that Indo-European social and ritual structures were durable enough to shape emerging state-level societies, even as localized innovation and syncretism produced regionally distinctive forms. The dissemination of Indo-European ideas was facilitated by both migration and cultural transmission. Linguistic, technological, and ritual concepts spread alongside trade, conquest, and elite mobility, establishing durable networks of knowledge and practice. Metallurgical techniques, wheeled transport, and mounted warfare, combined with ritual and linguistic frameworks, provided a coherent set of tools for social organization and state formation. Archaeological finds, from corded-ware burials in Central Europe to chariot burials in the Eurasian steppe, highlight the continuity and adaptation of these systems across diverse environments. Scholars assess the Indo-European legacy in both linguistic and cultural dimensions. Linguistic reconstruction enables the identification of shared roots, demonstrating that key concepts, such as governance, kinship, and ritual practice, originated from common Proto-Indo-European systems. Material culture provides complementary evidence, confirming that social, economic, and ritual frameworks persisted even as populations diversified and adapted to regional contexts. Together, these strands illustrate the multifaceted influence of Indo-European societies on subsequent civilizations. The endurance of Indo-European structures also raises questions of continuity and transformation. While vocabulary and conceptual categories persisted, localized adaptation and syncretism produced significant variation. Ritual practices, social hierarchies, and political organization evolved in response to environmental, economic, and cultural pressures. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that Indo-European legacies were not rigidly imposed, but were negotiated and reinterpreted by successive generations, producing diverse cultural expressions while retaining underlying structural principles. Modern scholarship further highlights the broad influence of Indo-European thought. Legal codes, literary conventions, religious cosmologies, and political organization in Europe, Persia, and South Asia show the integration of steppe-derived conceptual frameworks into urbanized and literate societies. The persistence of Indo-European linguistic structures facilitated the codification of knowledge, administrative communication, and intergenerational transmission of social norms, enabling the endurance of cultural patterns over thousands of years. By the end of this phase, Indo-European influence had become deeply embedded in the linguistic, social, and ideological fabric of Eurasia. Words, rituals, and material forms derived from Proto-Indo-European origins continue to inform contemporary thought, governance, and cultural expression. The study of these legacies allows historians, archaeologists, and linguists to trace the continuity of human knowledge and organization from the steppe to modern civilizations. Legacy invites scholarly debate. While the persistence of language, ritual, and social structure is evident, the degree to which Indo-European systems directly shaped subsequent societies remains an active area of inquiry. Evidence from archaeology, philology, and comparative mythology must be interpreted carefully, balancing continuity with regional innovation. Nonetheless, the cumulative record confirms that Proto-Indo-European societies established foundational structures, linguistic, social, and ritual, that continue to influence modern cultures, providing a tangible link between the ancient steppe and contemporary Eurasian civilizations. Before we continue exploring the next chapter of history, hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to receive daily Nightfall history videos. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which insight or discovery from this documentary surprised you the most. Your engagement helps us continue delivering fact-rich, scholarly historical storytelling directly to your screen.